The Federation isn't some communist utopia. It's mid-20th century liberalism seen through beer goggles. And while it's often still held up as a positive vision, a future to aspire to, it's yesterday's progressivism, a rosy self-image of America from the 1960s through the 90s, almost conservative in some respects now, not so much a possible future as a might have been projected from a world that no longer exists. Is the Star Trek future a relic to be set aside, or is it a guidepost back to the path? So first off, what is the Star Trek future? Starships and teleporters are cool, but they're storytelling devices, not core ideas. At its core, it's a story about people with different backgrounds and ideas coming together to build something, overcoming conflicts with diplomacy and mutual respect, a growing civilization within a liberal framework. By liberalism, I'm referring to the entire liberal tradition that political authority doesn't exist by divine right, that individuals have rights, including property rights, that laws must be consistently applied and knowable. So, contrary to the current political usage, in this context, conservatives are liberals too, from that same set of ideas. Star Trek doesn't pretend to be a blueprint for building that world, only a glimpse into it. For example, that no money thing that keeps coming up. Most of what people know about how it supposedly works is just the speculation of nerds on the internet. We didn't get much of an in-show attempt at explanation until Star Trek was resurrected in September of 2017. No, not that. I'm talking about the spiritual successor of 90s Star Trek. Despite being a goofy spoof, the Orville gets the core of Next Gen in a way that Discovery doesn't even aim for. And it offers a partial explanation of how their society functions.
See, on your planet, currency is money. In the Union, it's reputation. So if you do something, anything that benefits our society, and you work hard at it, you're rich.
It's not a new idea. Libertarians and anarchists have been talking about this sort of thing for a long time, and we have a degree of it. A good reputation can translate to real money without actually taking more work, giving better results, or even being deserved. And of course, it can be easily sullied by a single error or all sorts of spurious means. It's not really an answer to the question of how does this no money thing work, so much as an indicator that they have a high-trust society. What the Orville does well is explicitly confront that post-scarcity doesn't automatically translate to post-capitalist or good outcomes. It adds a little non-canon prime directive backstory about how such interference took an entire world from 21st century analog to adventures in the Forbidden Zone in just a few years. Instead of the instant post-capitalist utopia as spoofed in Lower Decks, the Orville goes much darker and truer to the original Trek implications, suggesting that while providing a society with unlimited energy and matter replicators should in theory make war utterly unnecessary, in practice it would probably just make war cheap. And if you subsidize something, you get more of it. The Star Trek future is less a function of technology than of culture. And I'm suggesting that Star Trek isn't a vision of perfected liberalism simply because it's a reflection of the culture that produced it, but because it's a system that works. It has a sort of institutional gravity to it, pulling people to loose consensus within it. Even radical out there movements, if they don't shatter from their own rigidity, tend to moderate in that direction. Because for all its many flaws, it works. Let's look at a real-world example of this, shifting from the Orville to Auroville. Auroville is a community founded in India in 1968 with the mission of creating a new kind of human community, one made up of people from all over the world and united by their humanness, working toward the evolution of a higher consciousness through a practice of integral yoga. Kind of woo-woo, it was the 60s. But unlike most such communities, this one not only survived, but continues to thrive. Where it's relevant here is that the vision for its economy started out with an idea that us Trekkies would find quite familiar. For in this ideal place, money would no longer be the sovereign lord. Individual worth would have a far greater importance than that of material wealth and social standing. There, work would not be a way to earn one's living, but a way to express oneself and to develop one's capacities and possibilities while being of service to the community as a whole, which, for its own part, would provide for each individual's subsistence and sphere of action. But of course, it's not so simple when actual human beings are involved. They've become many small sub-communities within the whole, all of them doing things a little bit differently. They've had all the difficulties that come with humans in groups: theft, violence, free riders, and mooches. Over the decades, they've had to find ways to adhere to their vision while accommodating it to the HSAP reality. And in the process, something interesting happened. Newcomers to Auroville need to bring enough money to build a house or join a collective housing arrangement. Cannot land in Auroville and expect free house, free land, or free anything else. Must self-support for at least a year. Work as a volunteer for at least a year, and make sure that they integrate into the community through work and commitment so that they find enough residents to vouch for them when the time for their entry assessment takes place. What began as a spiritual pseudo-communistic experiment has evolved into essentially a liberal democracy that requires buy-in, with a collective health insurance system requiring monthly dues, enforceable work expectations, and entry requirements that would get one labeled far right if they were suggested for any European country today. Because it works. It looks upward towards something better, but it keeps its feet firmly in the reality of human behavior. And that's kind of the Star Trek vision. Not some magical communist utopia where everything is free, but refinement of what we've had in America and Western Europe for generations. More prosperous, more egalitarian, but still essentially that post-World War II liberal democratic social order. Fukuyama's end of history with a polished shine. But history didn't end. We didn't settle into a peaceful global order just tweaking liberalism and capitalism. In fact, the world has been moving away from liberalism on some levels, whether the rise of Islamic fundamentalism, Russia moving back toward authoritarian rule, or the widespread abandonment of liberal ideas in the Western world as young people especially move toward the illiberal ideologies of the left and right. Even the neoliberalism of the American and European establishment is mostly technocratic rule wearing liberalism as a skin suit at this point. Elections are skewed toward only offering acceptable choices, and if the people manage to choose outside of that narrow lane, action is taken to correct their error. For example, the overturning of Georgescu's election win in Romania in 2024, or the slow-walk sabotage of Brexit. Whether either of those was the wrong decision or not isn't the issue here. There's a lot of angles to dig into and argue about. The relevant detail in this discussion is that they were deemed to be wrong by an entrenched power structure unresponsive to the democratic process. And there's a big problem there. Bad policies arrived at through the democratic process can be extremely damaging, but overriding the democratic process to avoid bad policies destroys faith in the process. It undermines the institutions. And that opens the door for tyrannical authoritarian movements of the left and right alike. When the process doesn't work, you try something else. One of the great strengths of liberalism is that it provides non-revolutionary avenues to address class issues. Improved working conditions and upward social mobility without having to kill a bunch of people in the streets? Sounds cool to me. And that's where we get some still glowing embers of the end of history. Capitalism coupled to liberal democracy with a welfare state turns out to be more of an alternative to Marxist socialism than a step toward it. It moderates between class interests to stitch together a broad base rather than throwing all in on one. When we start to look at the Federation less as some distant future utopia and more as just the better America vision at its root, something jumps out. The real defining technology of Star Trek society isn't replicators or warp drive. It's social cohesion, a high-trust society. Its multiculturalism keeps it fresh because it works within an umbrella of a superculture based on essentially Western liberal values and attitudes. It's open to new people joining it because it can assimilate them.
You know, in some ways, you're even worse than the Borg.
And notably, it embodies specifically Western liberal values of the latter half of the last century, not the progressive movements of today. There's a willingness to enforce norms of morality. They recognize, for example, that Klingons have a violent culture, but Individual Klingons can't just murder people at the wormhole Bucky's and have the authorities shrug. It would be culturally insensitive and racist to put him in prison. He doesn't understand that he's not supposed to do that here. There are expectations of proper conduct and consequences for not meeting those expectations. There is a solid work ethic underpinning their society. If Starfleet is any indication, it's highly meritocratic and people strive for status and compete for position and connections. When we look at Star Trek from a social standpoint, it's rather traditional. Star Trek is yesterday's progressivism. It's forward-looking, but there's, at least by today's standards, a wide traditionalist streak too. And while Trek has pushed back on the dangers of authoritarianism on several occasions, it took the Orville to really push the other way and bluntly illustrate that radical egalitarianism and direct democracy can be just as capricious, tyrannical, and anti-human as any dictatorship.
An absolute unstructured democracy. There is no record of any previously discovered society operating in such a fashion.
Government by American Idol.
Bringing us back to that old-school liberalism. Established authorities operating within clearly defined limits. A populace in broad agreement on the big things they want for their society, even when they deeply disagree on how best to achieve them. And a sense of rational patriotism. Starfleet isn't a bunch of space pinkos expecting the state to wither away or prattling on about how Federation colonies are built on stolen planets. They're people with ambition, pride, a burning and unapologetic drive to build things, to grow, to become something greater while being proud of who they are. They're proud of what they've achieved and they have reverence for the institutions they've built, especially Starfleet, the military. Some might think I'm flirting with a fascist interpretation of Star Trek here, and that's not entirely baseless. Harkening back to one of its predecessors, Things to Come, which was meant as a socialist story, but when it was released in 1936 resonated with fascists, particularly British fascists, who saw themselves in the saviors of its world. There were plenty of parallels to justify that interpretation. Star Trek is much less militant, but it still depicts a society that recognizes that its values are not universally shared, that there are external threats, that to remain a high-trust society, it must necessarily hold those outsiders apart, recognizing the cultural gap. You don't get to join the Federation just by showing up. There are necessary exclusionary measures in place. Let's look at the Maquis storyline as an example. The Federation isn't so rigid and expansionist that it can't give up colonized planets as part of a formal peace treaty. But there would never have been a Star Trek episode where military-aged Cardassian men landing on those planets were labeled refugees and given preferential treatment at the expense of the humans, Vulcans, and Andorians that built the place. The upside is that if we look at Star Trek as a desirable vision of the future and honestly evaluate it from a social and structural standpoint based on what it shows us, we don't need replicators or starships to do it. Those are storytelling trappings, not core ideas. The society it depicts is, from the standpoint of our current politics, a throwback to the late 20th century, but a little bit better. A diverse collection of people working toward common goals, technology that actually benefits everyone, looking to the horizon without running off the cliff. And that's the real hitch now. Today's progressives have left the idealism of Star Trek behind. But Star Trek has always been woke, I've heard it said. No. Star Trek has always leaned left. It's always been progressive. But over Trek's almost 60 years, the progressives won most of the big battles, and rather than building prosperity and consensus on those wins, instead charged into crusades over pronouns and microaggressions. Woke is what happened when progressivism broke under the weight of its own success, which is not an attack on anyone's lifestyle choices. I'm too lazy to oppress anyone, even if I cared what they were doing. But a lot of the activism has gotten silly. Star Trek shows us something quite different than the divisive identity politics and performative victimhood of the last few years. It shows us something a bit conservative in the sense of limited government, national identities, for lack of a better term, balanced cultural pride, neither the xenophobia of the far right nor the xenophilia of the cracked left, but a healthy sense of who we are, who they are, openness to cooperation when beneficial, with acknowledgement of differences, some of them quite fundamental. It's not right-wing, it's not libertarian, it's just liberalism, but cooler. A lot of Federation technology, replicators, medical devices that literally wave away injuries and infections, can be read as just shorthand for an extensive social safety net. It seems that healthcare isn't a problem in the Federation. People have plenty to eat, there's no more poverty. This is entirely achievable, even without magic walls that shit out cake and martinis. The trick is to do it in a way that doesn't crush the adventurous entrepreneurial spirit that other aspects of our culture foster, and that Star Trek holds up as core values. Push the envelope, invent something, make the world better, go where no man has gone before. The technological and managerial challenge is to solve the distribution problem with productive efficiency, economic growth, innovation, not a stifling high-tax bureaucracy that hemorrhages money at every step while delivering the minimal standard, and without settling into the trap of managed decline dolled up as sustainability. We have to end capitalism. Okay, what does that look like? Usually the answer is just repackaging the same old socialist failures of the last century. No, we're not doing that shit again. It doesn't work. More realistic is some kind of rebalanced capitalism, strengthening the economic position of the working and middle classes, shifting the profit focus from quarters to years or perhaps even decades, building value rather than momentary share prices. Maybe this requires some state intervention. Perhaps we have to change the calculus for manufacturers of consumer goods. We probably wouldn't have phones as disposable accessories designed to fail and block OS updates after a few years if rare earths and helium were treated as strategic commodities, for example. Maybe we have to completely restructure how the stock market works. What a nightmare that process would be. But this requires an honest assessment of failures, bad ideas, and probable outcomes. Yesterday's progressivism may still be a viable path forward.
Would that constitute a joke?
In which case, we'd have to be willing to go backward in some sense. No, I'm not talking about making it illegal to be gay, repealing the 19th Amendment, or bringing back slavery. I'm saying that a lot of today's radical politics, particularly on the left, the ever-fracturing identity spectrum, the fixation on phantom fascism, isn't progressive at all. It's just the ideological noise of children who got what they asked for and decided to throw a tantrum anyway. So what does this process actually look like? For one thing, we have to ditch the identity politics. This doesn't mean just pretending everything is fine, but rather a shift in perspective to something closer to the real issues. Americans talk about race in part to avoid talking about class. It leads to absurdities such as wealthy establishment mouthpieces like Ibram Kendi lecturing poor working-class white people about their privilege, or upper-middle-class college kids flaunting their crippling neurodivergence while seemingly unaware that actual disadvantaged and downtrodden people do the opposite. They front to hide their weakness because weakness invites predatory behavior. I've worked in inner-city schools and spent a lot of times in universities. I have seen this process from both sides. The victimhood performance only starts when there's no real perceived danger. And we have to have an honest discussion about wealth distribution. Tax the rich is a child solution, but we do have a structural transfer of wealth from the working and middle classes upward, and it's a serious problem. Couples working decent jobs still not being able to afford to buy a home is a problem. The erosion of savings through inflation, shrinkflation, and general enshittification of goods and services is a problem. Ballooning healthcare costs. But the problem isn't that billionaires exist. It's that working people are perpetually on the edge of financial ruin and can't save anything after rent, healthcare costs, and taxes. The extraction mechanism takes too much. The value proposition of backing the system is lacking. Any realistic solution is going to have to accept that capitalism is a system, not in the sense of a bunch of guys came up with a way to organize it, but more in the sense that respiration is a system inherent to how a human body functions. It wasn't invented, it evolved through adaptation alongside all the other interconnected systems that keep the organism alive. It doesn't exist independently as a hot swappable component. We can't just yank capitalism, plug in socialism, and not have massive disruption and layers of deeply negative unintended consequences. But maybe we can improve things in a more holistic way. We can't transmute matter, and the space elves aren't coming to help us. Let's see how that line ages. We have to build a future from where we are with the world we have. Finding those solutions is going to be a long and contentious process, but the first step is agreeing that that is the process, the potentially achievable path forward. Though maybe with a little detour through something more like Starship Troopers before we get to Star Trek. Star Trek gives us World War III and near civilizational collapse as the dividing line between our world and that one. But the path to the Star Trek future doesn't have to go through cataclysm, world war, or extraterrestrial benefactors. It can be done with a reliance on old, boring 20th century liberalism with just a little more vision, boldness, and confidence. At least, it could have been. Maybe its time has passed and we should leave Star Trek and its brand of expansive liberalism in the last century. Sort of a Gernsback continuum echo of a future we missed. And yet, that missed future still has a hold on a lot of people, crossing the political and generational divides of our society. It still has a pull, enough to wonder if perhaps yesterday's progressivism may yet be the path forward, even if it means a few steps back. Whatever the case, it's a long road there from here. I'm fairly sure YouTube can't ding me for copyright on a song in your head, at least not yet. And without settling into the trap of managed decline dolled up as sustainability. I'll just wait for the private jet to fly past before continuing.